Welcome to All Things Storybound, a creative outlet where any and all kinds of stories come to life.
Let us take you on a journey you've never experienced before.
Grab your favorite drink and get comfortable. You're in for a wild story ahead. Part 1: Missing. Rebecca startled as she heard the doorbell ring. Sitting at her cluttered kitchen table covered in photographs and documents, she stared at the mess listlessly for a long moment before dragging herself to the front door. She had a feeling she knew who was on the other side, and he never had good news. She took a deep, calming breath, let it out slowly, and then reached for the handle, accepting that she would have to face this man once again. When she opened the door, as she expected, a tall, broad-shouldered, slightly round man in business casual wear was standing there waiting for her. She put on a fake smile and greeted him. "Hello, Detective Vaughn. Nice to see you again. I assume you have an update on my husband for me?" Rebecca asked dryly, leaning against the doorframe. Detective Vaughn gave a half-hearted smile and gestured with his hand, then asked,
I do. Do you mind if I come in?
Rebecca stepped back and allowed him to step inside her home, guiding him to the dining room table. She gathered papers and photos into piles and cleared off space, offering the detective a place to sit. "Sorry for the mess. You know how it's been. Can I get you a drink? Coffee?" The detective nodded. She mindlessly poured him a cup of slightly stale coffee into a mug, handing it to him, and they sat down stiffly, tension hanging in the room. Detective Vaughn fidgeted with a photo on top of the piles and slowly made eye contact. The moment felt like an hour before he spoke.
Mrs. Everson, I'll get right to it. I'm here to tell you we've stopped the search efforts for your husband.
Rebecca stilled, and he took a moment to gather himself before he continued.
We will continue to investigate his disappearance, but at this point, the case has gone cold. We will continue to update you with any new information we have as we've done throughout the investigation.
He said, putting the photo back. It was a picture of her missing husband, Michael, and a few of his friends from a few months ago. He looked happy and relaxed, wearing his favorite football jersey. He'd been missing for over 2 months, and Rebecca missed him so much. She glared the detective down, letting the information sink in. "So you're just giving up on him?" Michael would not just leave. Something happened to him. I know it did in my gut. You know what? I'll figure it out on my own. Have a great day, detective. She stood up from her chair and motioned to the door. The detective hesitated but stood up, thanked her for the coffee that he didn't drink, and walked to the front door. He took one last moment before leaving, turned and placed his hand on the doorframe, standing tall and looking her straight in the eyes, and said,
I promise you, Miss Everson, we're still trying. There's just nothing to go on. I'm sorry.
and with defeat in his posture, walked to his car. Slamming the door closed, Rebecca fumed. 2 months and they'd given up? Unacceptable, she thought. She made her way out the back door to the only thing that calmed her down, her garden. Rows of raised garden beds glimmered in the early afternoon sun. Vegetables, berries, flowers, and herbs blossomed from wooden beds a few feet from the ground. Michael had built this garden with her. It was her sanctuary, her safe place. She began to prune and weed, letting the monotonous activity free the rage from her mind. She pulled anything dead and non-productive from the plants, and then pulled any ripe vegetation and pulled it inside, putting it away. Feeling marginally better, Rebecca sat back down at the kitchen table, pulling out stacks of paperwork and copies of reports in front of her to go over for what felt like the millionth time. What all did the police know about Michael's disappearance? He went missing a little more than 2 months ago overnight. His clothes, wallet, phone, car, everything were all left at home. He just disappeared into the night. It was at that moment an odd squeak sounded from upstairs. It almost sounded like footsteps on the hardwood. That can't be right. She's home alone. Goosebumps flooded her skin. "Hello?" she called upstairs, praying no one answered back. She stood up quickly, the sound of the chair screeching across the floor like the scream in a too-quiet house. She stalked across the home, grabbing the baseball bat she kept by the back door, and slowly crept upstairs, checking every shadow in the room. She made her way through the upstairs portion of the house, checking for the source of the noise. The hall closet was dark, but aside from the outerwear, empty of anything alive. The bathroom was lit by a nightlight, making it easy to tell no one was inside, including the walk-in shower. All that was left were the 2 bedrooms and master bath. Taking a deep, not remotely settling breath, she stepped inside the already open door to the guest room and, sweeping her eyes across the room, it was completely empty aside from the furniture. Leaving the guest room, she held the bat above her shoulder and prepared to enter her bedroom. Tense and ready to swing, she threw herself inside. Scanning the space, everything looked entirely normal. Her bed was made, house shoes next to it as usual, and the closet door was closed. There wasn't space under the bed for a person, so she kept her back to the wall and crept silently to the master bath. Keeping the bat high, she could see inside the small space with just the light from the window, and it too appeared empty. Confused and still on high alert, she remembered she had one small space she still needed to check: the closet. Sneaking out of the master bathroom, she made her way to the closet, bat in her right hand, grabbing the doorknob with her left and preparing for battle. Counting mentally to 3, she flung the door open and swung the bat down hard. It hit her shoe rack. There was no one inside. I must be losing my mind, she thought out loud, closing the door. Her shoulders relaxed and she laughed at herself a little bit. Really? A baseball bat against an intruder? The house must be settling. Who knows? She took one last look at her room, held the bat in a relaxed grip by her leg, and walked back downstairs, the house still eerily quiet. As she took the turn to put the back by the back door, her skin prickled in goosebumps and her hair felt like it stood on end. Before she could react, a blinding pain seared her skull and she could feel herself falling to the ground, her vision going dark. Part 2. Home. Head throbbing, Rebecca tried to open her eyes. The room felt cool and damp. Willing her vision to work, she forced her eyelids open and stared into a dark, concrete space that looked vaguely familiar in her confused, probably concussed state. Trying to think through the panic, she tried moving her hands and feet, but found they were bound, but at least she was sitting up. There was a dim light coming from above, and while it was blurry, she could make out a heavy door. It still looked so familiar, but she just couldn't place it and her head was so painful. It throbbed from the left side of her skull, sharp pain bolting like lightning down every millimeter of her body with every heartbeat. She could feel dried blood matted in her hair, and if she shifted even slightly, her clothes pulled against the blood stuck to her skin where it drifted down and dried. Clearly, she had been unconscious for quite some time. Assessing her situation, she did a quick rundown in her head. 1. Her hands were zip-tied together. 2. Her feet were also zip-tied together. 3. She appeared to be locked in a concrete room. 4. She was possibly concussed, but alive. From these things, even with her head throbbing, she could come to a couple of conclusions. 1. Whoever has me probably doesn't want me dead, at least not right away. 2. I have use of my hands, but not free use of them, and the same with my feet. So, I'm trapped but not completely helpless. 3. My mouth isn't covered, so it must not matter if I make noise or scream. Probably not good. As she leans against the concrete, head throbbing, trying to think of a plan, a loud metallic sound jarred her from her thoughts. She realized there was a metal door only a couple feet from where she was sitting, and it was creaking open. 1 foot, then 2, wearing brown hiking boots, stepped inside. Her eyes made their way up, almost without her consent, taking stock of the person coming into the room. He was wearing jeans and a black t-shirt, trim body, but when she got to his face, she knew immediately that everything was about to change. She knew that face. Michael was the man who had just locked her in this room, her missing husband. Michael's normally soft brown eyes were cold and dark. His smile lines that used to show so much happiness now just showed a deep, menacing scowl. His past carefree, relaxed posture was now rigid and closed off. Waves of rage rolling off of him, so palpable you could nearly see it in the air surrounding him, like the waves of heat off the pavement on hot summer afternoons, shimmering in a glaring warning not to touch. And then he spoke.
Bex, so good to see you awake.
He leaned against the door.
Such a shame we had to meet again this way. But you made that happen, didn't you?
Rebecca stared at him in horror. Her body, already covered head to toe in goosebumps, began to shiver in fear. Michael took a moment to look her over, then squatted down to eye level. It was truly terrifying. This man, the man she married, shared a bed and a life with for so many years, the man she fell completely in love with, it turns out she didn't know at all. Reaching out, Michael forcibly tilted her chin, his nails digging into the soft skin of her cheeks.
Rebecca, look at me. You did this. You know exactly what happened to me, but you won't admit it, will you?
Rebecca's body was shaking furiously, the skin under the zip ties at her wrists and feet beginning to bleed. Michael continued.
You think you can get away with murder? Play the grieving wife card? Go on with life like nothing happened?
Suddenly, his hand left her chin and wrapped around her throat. As his grip tightened, Rebecca fought him, her bound hands uselessly clawing at his skin. He pulls her closer, inches from his own face, and hissed.
I will show you how to play this game, Rebecca, and this time I'll win.
Moments before she lost consciousness, he threw her to the ground, letting go of her neck. She gasped for air, her vision coming and going as her head throbbed from not only the initial attack but the hit on the concrete floor. Michael hovered over her, his body a silhouette against the dim light above. He tilted his head mockingly.
You're not making it out of this alive. Our vows did say, till death do us part, Bex. That's a promise I intend to keep.
And Rebecca's vision went black again. When she regained consciousness, she tried opening her eyes, but realized one was swollen shut. From the little she could see and feel, she was still in the same dark, dreary concrete room, but at least she was alone. Ignoring the pain thrumming through her body, she tried to make a plan to get out. Her life depended on it. Michael made that very clear. Vision blurry and hands shaking, she took stock of everything she had, which wasn't much. She was wearing shoes, but they didn't have laces, so that didn't do much good. Her leggings had pockets, but Michael had either taken her phone or she'd lost it somewhere. Not that she was entirely sure where she was anyway, or that she would have service to make a call for help. Considering nothing she physically had on her person was going to help the situation, she assessed the room. Finally able to get a clear look, she realized she knew where she was, her own storm shelter. Now this, she may be able to work with. It looked like Michael had cleared out all the emergency supplies, but she knew this room well. With the tiniest spark of hope lighting a fire in her veins, she dragged herself to the door. The light was dim, but she could make out exactly what she was hoping to see. The screws in the door stuck out just enough that she should be able to use them to saw off the zip ties. Maybe. As silently as possible, so that if Michael was close enough to hear, she swung her bloody ankles over the screw closest to the ground, attempting to free her feet first so she could run if she needed to. She sawed up and down, the movement hitting her already battered skin and cutting it deeper, but she didn't stop. It made an awful, grinding noise, but she gritted her teeth and powered on. Finally, what felt like hours later, the zip tie popped free. Rebecca didn't realize until then how much sensation she'd lost in her feet, and it came flooding in. The pins and needles prickling against the raw open wounds. It took everything she had not to cry out in pain. Between the various cuts, the prickling, the concussion, and the general pain of being in a sitting position for hours on a hard floor, it felt like her body was done. But she couldn't stop yet. She stood up, feeling more prepared to fight if Michael came in, and aimed her wrists at a screw closer to waist height. Rebecca began sawing furiously, her wrists hitting the screw, creating a symphony of new lesions, the blood dripping down the door. She ignored the pain and focused on the adrenaline flowing through her body. As she vigorously scraped the zip tie against the jutted screw, it sank deep into Rebecca's already flayed wrist. Blood spattered and ran in haunting rivulets down the walls and floor, creating a grimy crimson work of art. Reacting on panic and instinct alone, she jerked her wrist free, the zip tie catching on the screw and cracking as it freed her bloody wrists, falling to the floor. Taking a deep, calming breath, she put pressure on her wrist and focused on what to do next. There was a window out of the storm shelter at the top of the door, showing it was evening. Rebecca hadn't risked looking out of it for fear of Michael being on the other side. But with her limbs free, she felt like she might be able to put up a fight. She hesitantly glanced out the window to the side view of her garden, no Michael in sight. It was early evening. Everything from the small part of the garden she could see appeared perfectly normal. Typically, you could open the door from the inside or outside, but she had a feeling it was somehow rigged to keep her in. She reached her hand to the door handle. It turned, and the door gave slightly inward, then stopped, something on the other side stopping it. Rebecca felt something inside her mind snap, and she took both hands, ignoring her still bleeding wrists, as she turned again the handle and pulled with the force of her entire body weight, and the hold on the door snapped. A piece of gardening twine was knotted and broken on the other side of the latch. She was free, but she had to be smart. Part 3. Revenge. Michael had to still be lurking around. She knew this. The long piece of twine he'd tied to try and keep her locked in was still tied to the garden spigot, and she made a split-second decision to take it with her, hoping against all odds that if she came into contact with him, she may have a fighting chance. Rebecca inched around the edge of her property, staying in the shadows as much as possible as she worked her way towards her car. It was fairly dark, but she wasn't taking any chances. She made her way to the front corner, and she heard a branch crack. She froze. Every dark shadow hid terrifying threat, and she didn't know what direction to go. Fear took over, and she bolted toward the driveway, running towards her car. She made it to the driver's side door and frantically pulled the handle, but it was locked. The alarm sounded. Rebecca turned to run, but pain ricocheted through her as a heavy body crushed her hard into the ground. Michael got up slowly, keeping pressure on her legs, forcing her to stay down. The moment he stood up, he had her by the ankles, dragging her flailing body back into the backyard. Rebecca dug her nails uselessly into the dirt and grass and kicked and fought, but Michael's grip was tight, and she was fighting a losing battle. She tried to scream, but it felt like air wouldn't fill her lungs, sound wouldn't come out. Panic consumed her thoughts, her emotions, her every muscle as she clawed for her freedom. They rounded the corner to the garden, and through Rebecca's panic, she noticed a glint that wasn't usually there. But the moment she focused on it, it disappeared. She twisted, trying to grab the edges of garden beds as they passed, but it was no use. Michael had full control. They passed the vegetables, the berries, and then the greenhouse, her shirt sliding up, exposing her already battered skin to more abuse. Michael slowed, but didn't stop. Between ragged breaths, he jerked Rebecca into a shallow grave as he confessed his final plans.
I'm going to end you like you tried to end me, Rebecca. But the difference is that I'm going to succeed. I know your dirty little secret, and I've told the cops all about it. Detective Vaughn, he's been watching you.
Michael sneered, jumping into the dirt and standing with one leg on her stomach to hold her down. He continued.
The good news is you won't be going to prison, Bex. You'll be rotting in the ground, fertilizing your precious garden.
As he spoke, he grabbed a shovel and started maniacally throwing dirt onto Rebecca, burying her alive. She tried desperately to breathe, dusting off the soil as it covered her mouth and nose. She kicked and pulled at his legs and the shovel, anything to get the upper hand, but nothing was working. And then she remembered the twine in her pocket. She took a deep breath and held it to avoid the dirt being thrown into her face, reached into her pocket for the twine, and tried to make a plan. Turning to take a quick, hopefully clean breath, she wrapped the twine around the head of the shovel as Michael threw another load of dirt onto her body. The twine, as she hoped, wrapped around the pole of the shovel, and she pulled it down using the element of surprise to her advantage. He dropped the shovel, and it landed so close to her face that she felt a rush of air against her skin. Rebecca threw her whole body's strength into grasping just above the head of the shovel and shoving it into Michael's jaw. He fell backward, stumbling, knees buckling and body crashing to the ground. That strange glint in Rebecca's peripheral vision became clearer, and a familiar male voice sounded from the corner of the yard.
Police! No one move!
Rebecca froze as Michael's lifeless body lay on the ground. She could only see just above the grave he dug for her, and while she recognized the voice, she wasn't 100% sure who it was. Then the broad shoulders and slightly rounded frame of Detective Vaughn came into view, standing far enough away to aim his gun at both her and Michael intermittently. He stood his ground and said,
Hands up. Both of you stay there.
the detective commanded as he kept one hand on his firearm and reached one to his handcuffs.
On your knees, Mrs. Everson.
Rebecca looked between the two men. Michael was still not moving, but she could see the rise and fall of his chest. She painstakingly, with her hands above her head, got her knees underneath her and kneeled. Detective Vaughn looked her in the eye as he slowly started moving towards her.
Don't do anything stupid. No fast movements.
He said in a slightly calmer voice. Rebecca was breathing hard as he came up to her at the grave, the gun still moving between her and her husband. He positioned himself between them, seeming to note that Michael was out cold, and stepped down into the cold dirt. He placed the handcuffs on her wrists with more care than she had expected, and as he stepped away, Michael groaned. The gun in Detective Vaughn's hands immediately pointed at Michael's head.
Please do not move. You're under arrest. Do you understand?
He ordered. Michael did not seem to understand. His body went rigid for a long moment, and his eyes widened while he seemed to think of an escape plan. In the span of a second, he rolled over, kicking Detective Vaughn in the knee and flinging himself to his feet and attempting to run. But the detective had clearly seen this coming. Even on one knee from the kick, he aimed at Michael and shot. The sound reverberated in the backyard, and Michael fell to the ground with a sickening thud. The detective quickly radioed for an ambulance, but Rebecca had a feeling Michael was finally gone, and her fight was over. The older man leaned over her husband's lifeless body, checking for a pulse, looked back at Rebecca, and shook his head. Part 4. The Reveal. Hours later, Rebecca sat in handcuffs at the local police station. She'd been arrested, taken to the hospital for her injuries, which thankfully were deemed minor, and released into custody of the police for questioning. The adrenaline had worn off quickly, and she felt like she'd been run over by a truck. The metal chair was particularly uncomfortable, and the handcuffs kept reopening the wounds on her wrist, making the fresh gauze turn bright red. It was a grim reminder of the day she'd had. The door opened, and a new officer stepped inside. He was younger, tall and skinny, with a boyish face. Rebecca didn't care who he was because in his hands he carried a cup of coffee and offered her a polite smile as he introduced himself.
Mrs. Everson, I'm Officer Barnett. I brought you a coffee.
He said in a friendly tone as he set down the coffee for her. The officer then sat down in the chair across from her and placed a few files and papers on the table and got a pen ready. He took a breath and spoke.
I'm here to collect your statement for this evening. Do you mind if we record this for accuracy?
He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recording device and put it on the table. Rebecca agreed to it. The door opened a second time, and Detective Vaughn came in, confidently pulling up a chair and sitting next to Officer Barnett, giving them both a nod to continue. Rebecca stared blankly at Officer Barnett as Detective Vaughn's eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. She cleared her throat. Do I just start from the beginning of the day, or... she asked, unsure of exactly what she was supposed to be doing. The room felt awkward and tense, so she fiddled with her own fingers. Detective Vaughn took control of the room, his voice sounding too loud for the small space.
Start at the beginning of the event, please. Be specific and don't leave out details. If we have questions, we may stop and ask for clarification. Begin anytime.
And then he clicked on the recording device, looking at her expectantly. Beginning when she met with the detective himself, she explained how she had heard a sound upstairs, checked it out to find nothing, and when she came back to put up the bat, she was hit in the head, waking up in the storm shelter. She told them how Michael had appeared and threatened her life, which was when Detective Vaughn spoke up with a question.
Mrs. Everson, you claim he told you he was going to end you. Did he speak of a motive?
Rebecca let out a frustrated breath before answering. He said it was because I was playing the grieving wife card and told me I was getting away with murder. Later, he told me he was going to end me like I tried to end him. She spoke of it like it was a matter of fact. Her mind whirred with possibilities of what the detective had figured out. She had, in fact, tried to kill Michael the night he went missing, but she wasn't going to admit that. No, she had a plan. Rebecca realized she was looking down at the table and looked up at the men in front of her. I had to fight him, you know. Her voice broke on the last word, tears beginning to form in her eyes, exactly what she was going for. Blinking away the fake tears, she continued. He told me he was going to kill me. I had no idea what he was talking about. My hands and my feet were stuck, and I couldn't move. I was so scared, and then he hit me so hard. She sobbed, nearly unable to get all the words out. Both Detective Vaughn and Officer Barnett seemed to be believing her, so she kept going. After hitting me and knocking me out again, he left. I don't know how much time passed, but I knew I had to get out of there. He had zip tied my wrists and feet together so I couldn't move, but I found a big screw on the door that I used to break them off. The door was kind of locked. He had twine on it, but I pulled it and the knot broke. So I ran around the front of the house to my car, but he must have heard me because he found me. Rebecca was giving a full-on show now. She cried and gasped for air, pulling tissues from a box provided for her, and made her hands shake when she reached for them like the memory was too much to bear. The sound of a throat clearing stopped her rambling for a moment, and she allowed Officer Barnett to cut in.
Mrs. Everson, I'm sorry you've been through this, but I need to ask. You said there was twine on the door, but our guys found twine in the hole he dug. Can you explain that?
Rebecca blinked more tears away as convincingly as possible, wiping at her eyes with a tissue before going back into her version of the story. When I got out of the shelter, I saw the twine. It was attached to the garden hose spigot, and I knew Michael was still around, so I took it off the spigot in case I needed it for protection. But then he found me by my car and tackled me. He pulled me by my legs to the backyard, to the hole, the grave. My grave, she said, releasing a breath to pause for dramatic effect, as if it was all too much for her to handle. Then she shuddered and continued on. Detective Vaughn came in somewhere around this point of the event. Michael dragged me into the grave and then held me down with his foot while trying to bury me with the shovel. I managed to use the twine to pull the shovel out of his hands and hit him with it in the jaw. That's when Detective Vaughn announced his presence. Michael was knocked out by the shovel at this point. I was in handcuffs, and then Michael woke up and he was fighting Detective Vaughn, and then Detective Vaughn shot him. Rebecca took in the resigned look on the men's faces as her story matched the night's events to what the detective had seen and experienced, and waited for more questions. She needed them to ask more questions for this to work. Thankfully, Detective Vaughn had more to ask.
Mrs. Everson, are you aware that an anonymous tip, now believed to have come from your husband, led us to believe that you have been responsible for at least 5 deaths in the past 3 years? The reason we believe it came from your husband was because it also included his near death of your hand. The tip stated that he was strangled, then buried alive in your garden.
In her mind, Rebecca was thrilled, but she only allowed shock to show on her face. She was still letting the fake tears flow down her face. What do you mean, deaths? Burying him alive? Why would I do that? I've been looking for him harder than all of you have. If I'd been trying to kill him, wouldn't I be happy he was gone? She spewed, her voice full of contempt and confusion. There it was, exactly what she needed. She was turning this all on Michael, exactly as she planned. Officer Barnett sighed, but Detective Vaughn was harder to crack than that. He stared at her like he could see through her lies, but Rebecca gave nothing away. He took in a breath and spoke in a measured voice.
Mrs. Everson, due to the death on your property, we were able to obtain a search warrant, and we found the bodies,
he said, full of confidence. What he didn't know was that Rebecca had planned on this in the hours she had been waiting on this interrogation. She took in a surprised, gasping breath. Bodies? You found bodies? Oh my God. She started to breathe heavily, really putting on a show. Officer Barnett looked like he was believing every lie out of her mouth, but she wasn't sure about Detective yet. Trying to hide an eye roll, the detective spoke again.
Yes, Miss Everson, bodies. Plural. Under your garden beds. What do you know about that?
Now was her chance to shine. Rebecca fought for her fake breath, shaking as she spoke. Michael, he built that whole garden for me. It was always my favorite place to go at home, but sometimes I'd come home from work or lunch with friends and he'd be covered in dirt, and he would just tell me he'd been building a new garden bed outside. I didn't think anything of it. I mean, he was a carpenter and he loved building things, right? And he loved the produce from the garden once I got it going. Are you saying every time he built me a new bed? Oh my God. And Rebecca began to gag. We have so many garden beds and the greenhouse. She continued gagging and crying. That seemed to seal the deal. Detective Vaughn produced a bottle of water and tried calming her down. Through the fake tears and almost throwing her up, her stomach was actually getting a little upset, so she took it. Both men now seemed to be mostly on her side. The detective had more questions. Softly, he asked,
This may be a difficult question, but do you remember when he built the first bed?
Rebecca slowed her fake fast breathing and answered, it was early spring, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I'm sorry, the garden is a fairly new hobby to me, but I don't remember dates. I thought he was just being nice. He did things like that, you know? Sometimes he would come home with flowers, or sometimes he would have chocolates. I never would have expected this. Her voice purposely broke off as she told fake stories about her dear husband. As both the detective and officer wrote down details, the recorder kept going. Officer Barnett was next to speak.
Do you know why your husband tried to kill you?
Rebecca blinked tears from her eyes and wiped them away with a tissue. She took a deep, fake, calming breath and said, No, not really. He kept saying I was trying to play the grieving wife card, but I don't know what he even meant by that. I tried looking for him when he went missing. I kept all the copies of documents he would let me have. I told you everything I knew. I searched for him until my feet bled. I thought we had a good marriage, but I guess I was wrong. Rebecca wasn't actually lying about some of that. When she realized Michael had dug himself from the grave, she knew she had to find him fast. There were more questions about where she was on certain nights, more questions on Michael and his activities before his disappearance. But finally, she was released for the night with the instruction to not leave town. Expecting to be followed, she got a ride to her house, which was still blocked off for forensics. Luckily, she was able to convince the officers to let her grab her purse, which thankfully was nowhere near the backyard, which was the real crime scene. Since her car was also part of the crime scene, she got a rideshare to a 24-hour convenience store to grab a new pair of sweats to change into and a bite to eat, then headed to a nearby motel. The forensics team wouldn't find anything on the bodies in the backyard, nor would they find anything in the house. She may bury the bodies under the garden beds, which Michael did actually build, having no idea there were bodies underneath. Well, until he found one. The night Michael nearly died, he'd been in the backyard when he found a hole under one of the garden beds, probably dug by an animal. Unfortunately, it was one of the first victims, and Rebecca hadn't buried them very deep. So he saw a bone and panicked, rushing inside to tell her there was a body under one of the beds. When he wanted to call the police, let's just say Rebecca wasn't a fan of the idea. That's when Michael started piecing it together. Rebecca was a serial killer, and every garden bed he had built was to cover a body, including the greenhouse. She brought him outside to look at the damage, then quickly hit him over the head with a fence post. Thinking he was dead, she started burying him in a new grave she was planning on using for her next victim, the next plot for her garden bed. She couldn't feel any breath from his chest, couldn't feel a heartbeat, but he must have hidden it somehow because the next morning, after she had her coffee, she went to go build the garden bed over him, and he was gone. She couldn't let her secret out, so she called the police and reported him missing. She kept up on every detail of the investigation, pretending to be a grieving wife, just like Michael had said. But then he'd come after her, and he'd died anyway. Now she'd successfully put all the blame on Michael for the murders, and she could start again. At the motel, she took a shower and climbed into bed. Her work began tomorrow, when she planned on finding a new burial ground. For the first time in months, a real smile lit up her face as she fell asleep. In the morning, she'd find her next victim and begin all over again.